Observation Presentation Assignment. Summaries, Opening Wishes and Goals. In this video, the therapist starts to build rapport by explaining to Claire that the things they talk about are confidential and that he will not speak behind her back with her parents. This is an important part of the client-therapist relationship because children's perception of rapport is positively associated with greater cooperation. When the client is a child, they may need some prompting to engage in the session. The therapist does this by asking the client to answer 3 questions. Claire becomes more comfortable with the therapist and shares more information as he demonstrates understanding and validates her answers. Overall, the interaction between the two of them appears to be calm and comfortable. The 3-step emotional trick. In this session, Mr. Summers Flanagan teaches Claire the 3-step emotional change trick as a way to connect thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Both the therapist and the client interact in a calm and comfortable manner, but this time the child voluntarily offers more information about herself to the therapist. The therapist uses age-appropriate explanations and terms that are easy for the child to grasp and comprehend. The therapist is encouraging and welcoming of Claire's answers and reinforces his beliefs that she is able to be in control of her thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Claire, what's good about you? In this session, Mr. Summers Flanagan challenges Claire to answer the question, what's good about you, in 10 different ways. He introduces this activity as a game to help increase Claire's interest and engagement in the activity. The therapist then summarizes all 10 points in his own words, and when doing so, Claire becomes very engaged in the conversation and elaborates more about the answers given. She smiles and laughs a bit as her confidence seems to increase as the therapist continues. Claire even tells the therapist that she feels like she can trust him. This exercise reveals to the therapist what Claire thinks about herself while also encouraging self-reflection and supporting self-esteem. Claire closing and summary. In this session, Mr. Summers Flanagan includes Claire in summarizing the things that they talked about in the session. This assists her in remembering all the things they worked on and reflect on what she learned. He assigns some homework for Claire to work on until their next time together, which challenges Claire to not just talk about things in therapy, but to apply them in her real life. Lastly, John tells Claire what to expect for their next session together, which is games. This helps to build her anticipation, making it something she looks forward to. TJ anger management. In the start of this session, TJ's body language, tone of voice, and short answers indicate that he's experiencing discomfort in the environment that he's in. Summers Flanagan acknowledges this by stating that he knows TJ is not really excited to be there. This one simple sentence begins the process of building rapport with the client by making him feel understood and validated. The therapist gives TJ a sense of control over the session by asking what good could come from it. He's not being told what to think or feel, but is allowed the chance to state his desire for the outcome. The therapist asks projective and guided questions that encourage self-reflection and helps to turn thought into action items to apply in real life. The therapist reframes TJ's answers as strengths, adding other qualities to the definition of what it means to be strong. By the end of the session, TJ's defense is lowered. He laughs a little and becomes more actively involved in the conversation. He was able to identify goals and ways to achieve those goals. Lewis and motivational interviewing. In this session, the therapist starts by asking what Lewis likes and dislikes about drinking, which demonstrates a desire to understand the client. There's no indication of judgment, but rather curiosity, which allows Lewis to open up more. Lewis is able to verbalize his own opinions versus giving the answers he thinks he should. Throughout the session, Lewis seems to give a few contradicting answers. The therapist does not point out these inconsistencies, but challenges Lewis to re-examine his beliefs and draw his own conclusions. He doesn't decide for Lewis what his limit should be. Lewis appears to be comfortable opening up to the therapist and admits to making some poor decisions while under the influence of alcohol. He also verbalizes that staying away from it would be imperative to making a good life for himself. These are powerful conclusions that the client came up with himself. John provides feedback to Lewis, praising him for recognizing these truths and encouraging him to act on these convictions more often. The therapist utilized a lot of paraphrasing throughout this session, as well as asking powerful questions that help the client to self-reflect and challenge some of his ways of thinking. Sample CBT session on social anxiety. In this session, the therapist opens by asking the client to give recent examples of the social anxiety and nervousness problems that have been occurring. This is helpful in addressing the specific situation instead of an overall concept of anxiety. The therapist engages Meredith in different activities that help the client to recognize unhealthy thought processes and develop healthier ways of thinking. that can directly improve the emotions she feels. He helps to make her emotions measurable and something to track over time by having her rate them on a number scale. He also has the client role play what she would tell a friend who was in the same position as her. She actively participates in the session and begins to recognize unhealthy thought patterns and ways to improve her thoughts. Mental status examination. The therapist starts the session by explaining what's going to happen during their time together and the purpose behind the questions he'll be asked. He explains that some of the questions will be easy and others harder, and then asks the client if that sounds okay to him. This builds rapport by setting expectations and inviting the client to actively participate in the session. When transitioning between topics, John makes the client aware of this, which helps the client transition along with the session. Despite some odd behavior from the client, John's able to stay calm and not allow this behavior to interfere with the session. John asks clarifying questions and paraphrases the answers that the client gives to ensure understanding. The client actively participates throughout the entire session, makes attempts at jokes, and appears to answer questions truthfully. John remains non-judgmental throughout the session, which allowed the client to be so open. Application of theories. Carl Rogers' person-centered theory can be applied to both Claire and Louise's session and can help us better understand these clients for different reasons. This theory believes that personal growth and self-knowledge occur to create self-empowerment if the therapist provides the necessary environment of acceptance, empathy, and congruence for the client to do so. Claire is a prepubescent girl who has a need for empathy and acceptance as she develops an idea of self-concept. She is allowed to explore her thoughts and feelings in a safe environment without fear of judgment. For Louise, the therapist does not display judgment toward his drinking problem, but instead explores his relationship to alcohol and his ideas about the substance. Even after Louise admits to making poor choices while under the influence, the therapist praises him for recognizing this and being aware of himself. Person-centered theory helps us to understand Louise better because it helps to create that empathetic space needed for growth. It also helps us allow Louis to come to his own conclusions regarding his alcohol use and setting his own limits. This reflects Rogers' theory well. Cognitive theory can be applied to Meredith's session on social anxiety as her maladaptive thoughts increased anxiety. Through a series of questions and activities, it was revealed that Meredith had an overall low opinion of herself as a person. Maladaptive beliefs about oneself and dysfunctional self-perception are at the core of social anxiety disorder. The root of Meredith's social anxiety was poor self-concept. By identifying the core issue, treatment can be focused toward the appropriate areas. Cognitive theory can also be applied to the mental status examination session as it has a heavy focus on thought processes. Cognitive theory seeks to understand how emotion and behavior are shaped by internal thought processes. The purpose of mental status examination is to gather information about a client through direct observation of the patient and systematic exploration of subjective experience. However, applying the cognitive theory helps us to better understand the client by realizing that there's more going on underneath the surface. Recalling the client's answer to "what is your name" is a good reference point. Cognitive theory helps us go beyond observation and toward understanding the why and how behind the thinking. Lastly, behavioral theory can be applied to TJ's session to help us better understand the client. This theory focuses on how behaviors are learned through reinforcement, punishment, and conditioning. Through his session, we learned that there's a history of fighting among his family members. Violence and fighting was a behavior that had been reinforced throughout his childhood as a sort of norm. Mr. Summers Flanagan helps TJ to connect his ideas about fighting to his perspective on strength and weakness and then apply it to his behavior. A 2024 study found that CBT-based anger management reduced levels of anger and aggression. By the end of that session, TJ went from being initially closed off and short with the counselor to voicing a desire to not only receive help for his anger challenges, but to help others in similar situations to overcome it as well. Biblical worldview application. Integration of a biblical worldview would be useful in these sessions because recognizing the client as being made in the image of God can help the therapist to treat the client with dignity and understanding. Considering the fact that Jesus came to earth for all mankind helps to reduce judgment and biases. Whether the client is 12 years old, an addict, someone with anger management problems, or someone with irregular thinking and behavior patterns, they're loved by God and created with inherent worth and value. Applying the characteristics of the fruit of the Spirit would shape the way the therapist approaches each session. Galatians 5:22-23 lists those characteristics as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. By demonstrating these characteristics toward the client, the therapist not only shows them the love of Christ, which is something they may have never seen before, but also sets the tone for the session and helps to establish rapport with the client. It also demonstrates overall respect toward each individual person. While entitled to their own type of worldview, a therapist should not impose that view upon their client. Regardless of the client's personal belief, the Bible offers therapeutic strategies such as prayer, processing emotions, forgiveness, and identity change. These are practical practices that can provide the client with significant healing throughout their time in counseling. For the client who holds a biblical worldview themselves, it would shape the way that they process and understand their own trauma or struggles. It would help them not only find purpose in those things, but also in their general existence. It provides individuals with a sense of hope and establishes their identity in Christ. Application of learning. Through observing these sessions, my biggest takeaway is that establishing rapport is vital to the counseling experience. This is something we learn in our very first counseling class, but to watch it unfold in the videos is incredibly valuable. I was astounded by the way in which the therapist was able to make such a large variety of clients comfortable within a matter of minutes, and I watched as their walls crumbled away quickly. He met the client where they were and adjusted to meet their needs. He was not forceful for them to recognize unhealthy patterns, behaviors, or ways of thinking, but he guided them to their own conclusions. Through intentional questioning, he was able to draw out useful information from the clients. Through reflective listening and paraphrasing their words back to them, the clients usually ended up expanding on their original statements to provide the therapist with more information to work with. Mr. Summers Flanagan utilized many different psychological theories and activities throughout his sessions. The unhelpful and helpful thought list was a practical activity that helped to reveal a distorted thought process, which assisted the client in identifying the root of their problem. The 3-step emotional change trick was an age-appropriate activity to assist the client in understanding how thought, feeling, and behavior worked together. Neither of these activities are particularly difficult, just practical. He did not make the client feel as if they had to become psychology experts. Instead, he helped to equip them with tools they can use in their everyday life outside the therapy room. I think that in a future career of counseling, I could apply many of his techniques to my own work, which will create an environment in which meaningful change is possible.